So hello, thank you very much for this very kind introduction and also for the invitation to come here. I'm really pleased to be here and to meet Norbert Ricken. We didn't see for a long time. He also was a member of this research group on Selbstbildung and as he was in Bremen, when he was in Bremen. And also therefore I'm very happy to be here, to have the opportunity to give a talk to you. And I have a very simple presentation, as you will see, but perhaps it will help you to follow my talk. My talk aims to bring knowledge into view as something that is not stored in the heads or in the bodies of individuals, but unfolds between the human and non-human participants, things, objects, artifacts of social practices. I will focus in particular on the question of how something new comes into being in collective practice and what role different sorts of knowledge play in this process. Since I'm not an expert in digital infrastructures at all, I will only be able to address a few of the questions mentioned in the abstract for this conference, and will mainly limit myself to quite simple examples from the world of sport to illustrate my theoretical considerations. In these examples, digital technologies do not yet play a major role. Nevertheless, I will cursorily address the aspect of virtuality in the sense of opening up spaces of potentiality and imagining alternatives. With the question of the practical formation of knowledge in the concert of human and non-human voices, respectively contributions, I enter a field that is, among other things, investigated by cognitive science, philosophy, and science and technology studies under keywords such as distributed cognition, situated action, situated knowledge, entanglement in the agential realism of Karen Barrett. And this field also includes works from the history and sociology of science, such as Hans-Jörg Reinberger's study on experimental systems and epistemic things from 1997, or Karin Knott-Cettina's work on the fabrication of scientific knowledge in experimental physics. These studies emphasize that scientific knowledge is not simply discovered, but fabricated. Fabricated in social interactions and negotiations with the active involvement of laboratories, devices, theoretical assumptions, and so on. Furthermore, power struggles and disputes over prestige, recognition, and funding, as well as the prevailing thinking styles, Ludwig Fleck, and norms of scientific community always play a role in the deciding what is recognized as valid knowledge and what, in contrast, is devalued as non-knowledge. This also concerns, for example, philosophical debates on the question of whether there's only propositional knowledge or whether, for example, the practical capacity to dodge a ball or to ride a bicycle can also be considered a sort of knowledge in its own right. Both the title of my talk and these short preliminary remarks should have made clear that I'm taking a practice theoretical perspective on the emergence and role of different sorts of knowledge in and for social practices. This implies that I'm not primarily interested in the fabrication of knowledge in special settings and practices of knowledge production, such as laboratories, but in the emergence of knowledge in all kinds of practices. Knowledge emerges, I would like to argue, and alluding to Louis Althusser's materialism of encounter, emerges from the contingent encounter of heterogeneous human and non-human human entities. At the same time, I would like to make it plausible that such encounters, while not predetermined, are also not completely arbitrary, but are subject to a variety of conditions and are thus a matter of conditioned contingency. Against this background, I will first sketch out a few basic features of my selective view of the vocabulary of recent practice theories and their reconceptualization of knowledge. In the second step, I will concretize the concerted formation of knowledge as a process of mutual enablement of people, bodies, and things in practice. Thirdly, I turn to the problem of the emergence of new and collective socio-technical or socio-imaginary constellations. Finally, I sketch out some thoughts on how and with what transformative effects digital data are engaged in the emergence of knowledge in practice. The knowledge of practices. I think I need some water. So first, the knowledge of practices. The bundle of theories labeled practice theories has gained considerable interest, inter- and transdisciplinary appeal over the last 4 decades. This bundle includes such diverse approaches as Pierre Bourdieu's praxeology, Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, Harold Garfinkel's ethnomethodology, Theodor Schatzky's social ontology, Michel de Certeau's art of practice, and often ignored, Alexei Leontiev's cultural historical activity theory. All these approaches differ, for example, in the understanding of practice with regard to the role they assign to human actors, or whether they emphasize reproduction or change of the given circumstances. However, a common thrust can be identified. Theories of practice are opposed to a mentalistic style of thinking and attributes human action either subjectivistically to the hidden motives and intentions of individual actors or objectivistically to supra-subjective structures, rules, norms, and codes that operate behind the scene. Instead, the praxeological interest is in the phenomenal and thus publicly accessible richness of the sensual and meaningful actions of embodied people in concrete material environments. Practice theories seek to make observable how social orders and their subjects are embodied, produced, maintained, and transformed in the interplay of people, natural things, and artifacts. While they do not necessarily deny the unique status of human actors, they do relativize the status. People no longer appear as autonomous centers of initiative, but as particular players among other participants, such as infrastructures, buildings, tools, language, technology, or even climatic conditions and animals. From this perspective, things are not merely passive instruments of human action, but come into view as co-actors in the social. Accordingly, they are attributed an own power or agency, which structures human behavior, thinking, and action. This agency can, as emphasized, for example, in actor-network theory, combine with human agency to form a new hybrid agency that transcends the boundaries between culture, nature, technology, and biology. In order to make it possible to observe how social orders and their subjects arise and the practical interplay between human and non-human beings, two perspectives can be distinguished methodologically. In a performance perspective, I call it, following Elizabeth Shove, practice as performance. The researcher tries to grasp and understand how the participants relate to each other in the flow of practice, what demands, expectations, and uncertainties they face, and what coping efforts they mobilize to assert themselves in the Merli of practice, im Handgemenge der Praxis. If, on the other hand, practices are observed as entities, practice as entity, interest is directed towards the historically developed, typified, and recognizable structures and patterns of activity that prefigure the practical performances and qualify each individual operation as a playing along. Practices such as driving a car, teaching at school, or playing tennis are, from this point of view, settings or stages in or on which single sayings and doings that are meaningless in themselves regularly link up in such a way that they become intelligible as contributions to this or that practice. For example, hitting a ball with a suitable object only becomes intelligible as a contribution to the game of tennis on the stage of tennis. And the human body only reveals itself on this stage as a tennis-playing body, whose movements can be evaluated by other participants as elegant, wooden, successful, or unsuccessful, based on the explicit and implicit norms of the game. A practice in this sense provides the individual doings with a framing and a direction. It organizes their meaningful concatenation. It tunes the perceptions, motivations, and affects of the human co-players to its internal structure of meaning, goals, and purposes. Fyodor Schatzky refers to this structure as the teleoaffective structure of a practice. In order to participate in a practice, a publicly acceptable way, and to cope with the turmoil of its performances, various capacities are required. For example, participants must know which game they are currently participating in, and they must have a practical sense, Pierre Bourdieu, not only of the explicit rules, but also and above all, of the implicit conventions of the game in question. In the practice theoretical discourse, a variety of terms are used for this sense, including tacit knowledge, skills, bodily techniques, Körpertechniken, routines, or habitus. They focus on different aspects, but they converge in designating an embodied practical knowledge that is not grasped by a hegemonic concept of propositional knowledge in Western modernity, and is thus dethematized as knowledge by this concept. Seen in this light, it is one of the merits, I would say, of the various cultural studies turns of recent decades, spatial turn, performative turn, practice turn, post-colonial turn, and so on, to have brought into view not only in knowing that, but also in knowing how, anchored in the material, the corporeal, the bodily, and the local, which is passed on primarily in a non-written way from body to body, orally or magically. This practical knowledge allows, for example, as Pierre Bourdieu has already emphasized, for appropriate action to be taken even under the conditions of uncertainty and time pressure that characterize many daily practices. However, if this knowledge is localized primarily in the bodies of human actors, as for example in Pierre Bourdieu's work, there is a risk of reproducing an understanding of knowledge and the subject as the carrier of this knowledge that is established in both the cognitive sciences and classical sociological action theories. With the only difference being that knowledge is no longer discovered in the minds but in the bodies of individuals. The role of material objects in the constitution of a situated capacity to act is then neglected. More recent practice theories, approaches, influenced not at least by debates in the sociology of technology, therefore also emphasize the resource aspect of things and are interested in the practice effects they bring about. In this perspective, things come into view, for example, as carriers of warranties of use, Gebrauchsgewährleistung, as Robert Schmidt wrote, or as infrastructures that can be relied on for support, like a handrail, Stefan Hirschauer. From this perspective, they encourage certain behaviors while inhibiting others, much like, I quote Stefan Hirschauer, tightly cut clothing. This view is also extended to symbolic infrastructures, such as language, and to digital technologies, such as the World Wide Web, which then comes into view, for example, as scaffolds for human speaking, thinking, and remembering. To describe their function and effect on or for human action, practice theoretical approaches like to draw on the concept of affordance, which comes from the psychology of perception. However, if they interpret affordance only as a latent offer of action, they miss the relational nature of this concept. As the inventor of this concept, James Gibson, writes, I quote, affordance is neither an objective property nor a subjective property. Art is both, if you like. And affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective-objective and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and effect of behavior. In affordance point both ways, to the environment and to the observer. Such a relational understanding of affordance makes it possible to observe how people and things mutually inspire and inform each other in practice, how they notify and form each other so that neither side remains as it is. From this perspective, things not only take on supporting functions and guarantee a certain use, but also appear as media of thinking, designing, and imaging. The archaeologist Lambros Malafouris demonstrates this under the nice title, I find it's a nice title, creative thinking. So not creative thinking, but creative thinking. In an ethnography of pottery making, it shows that people not only think about the things, but that they think with the things and through the things. In the concrete handling of their materiality, their potentials are explored and projects, Entwürfe, of what one could do with or out of them arise. Unlike a plan, a project, an Entwurf, is not a rationally thought out plan that can be realized and practiced through technical action, but rather an idea, as for example Cornelius Castoriadis explains, an idea that is only developed under actual conditions and is continuously modeled and practiced until it materializes at some point in a realized object. Malafouris' ethnography shows that the materialities or things involved in a practice are not external to human thought and action, but that they are involved in their constitution. They are, so to speak, taken into thought, motivating and orientating thinking and acting subsequently from within, and conversely only acquire their concrete form and meaning for the actor in practice. Alexei Leontiev refers to this object-relatedness of practice as constitutive for thinking and acting as its inescapable objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit. This objectivity by no means characterizes only practices in which a tangible object is produced from a raw material, as in pottery, but also unproductive activities such as play or sport. Volker Schürmann illustrates this by referring to Leontief's activity theory using the example of hurdle racing. From an activity theory perspective, the hurdles are not, as in classical action theory, external environmental conditions or constraints that artificially make it difficult for a subject to realize his intention of covering a certain distance in the shortest possible time, but rather they define the intention itself. And with this intention, the effective striving of the subject. And conversely, it is only through the subject's athletic practice that the objects placed on the running track becomes the meaning as hurdles in a sporting sense. To describe such co-constitutive relationships between human and non-human participants, my colleagues Nikolaus Buschmann, Christina Brümmer, Matthias Michaele, and I have proposed the concept of mutual enablement. In the threefold meaning of this concept, the threefold meaning of to enable, to be enabled, and to be able to, it emphasizes that enabling does not boil down to the transfer of knowledge from one pole to another, but that the entities participating in a practice mutually bring each other into play, engage each other, and attribute possibilities for action to each other. This process is not, however, a creatio ex nihilo, but is full of preconditions. The participants must already have certain dispositions and be disposed towards each other in order to be able to bring each other into play. We therefore differentiate conceptually between disposition and competence. Dispositions are still diffuse, opaque, and indeterminate. They have the status of, for example, motor, cognitive, or affective potentialities, which only gain the form of addressable competences in the relational network of practice. Being disposed towards one another does not necessarily mean that the dispositions of the co-players must match like a pork and a lid. Rather, it is more modestly about the potential to connect with one another. Accordingly, the result of a coupling does not necessarily have to be a smooth functioning, but can also be an irritation or break off. For example, when a participant withdraws and decouples out of listlessness, overload, shyness, or failure. Accordingly, enablements have their flip side in an always possible disenablement. An object presents itself as resistant in a given situation and eludes use because its design, its technology, or its manageability finds no point of connection in an actor. Or students do not find access to the dispositives of school teaching because the unfamiliar habitus of the social middle classes materializes in these dispositives. In these cases, the embodied dispositions of certain groups of people are dequalified and prevented from forming into a recognized competence. They show that not everyone who potentially knows something can also appear as a knower. He experiences, so to say, an epistemic injustice when he is prevented by socio-material circumstances from allowing his dispositional potentialities to enter the public sphere as knowledge. From the perspective of a sociology of practices, the relational process of mutual enablement is reflexive not only in the sense that the co-players orientate their activities towards each other, rather the way in which they do so is also related to the general understandings and the teleoaffective structures that organize the currently performed practice. For example, when playing football, the participants observe and enable themselves, their bodies, their doings, their sayings in different ways than when playing volleyball. Or when skateboarding in public space, the urban furniture is used differently than when shopping, and so on. This means relational affordances in which the participants inform and enable each other do not arise in vacuum, but in the context of the practice currently being performed. This also affects the formation of practical knowledge about how something is done. A key medium of this knowledge is the body's experience-based capacities to perceive and to sense. In the performance of a practice, these capacities adjust to its teleoaffective structure, and in this adaptation, they usually ensure that the bodily doings and sayings are brought into a form that is orientated towards the requirements, the goals and norms of the respective practice. An action then becomes recognizable, for example, as playing volleyball, giving a lecture, or programming. The relevant artifacts, playing field, lecture desk, keyboard, screen, etc., and explicit, that means tactical, for example, tactical knowledge of running and ball paths, as well as conscious reflection are always involved in this essentially bodily self-organization of action, as for example, praxeographic studies of sport acrobatics or volleyball show. Jointly, embodied sensory capacities, implicit practical knowledge, and explicit theoretical knowledge establish what Leontiev calls an impractical co-knowledge, Mitwissen, that is directed towards the respective activity and organizes the doings in the form of a multimodal reflection to one's own actions. Incidentally, this insight also challenges the widespread, for example, in ethnomethodology, the widespread assumption that reflection only begins when a know-how-based routine fails. In the past, practice theoretical approaches were primarily interested in how habits solidify in the relationships between bodies and things, which contributes to the reproduction of existing structures. For some time, however, praxeological interest has also been directed towards changes and the emergence of the new. In this context, transformation is primarily explained in terms of the shifts in and reconstellations of materialities, competences, meanings, and practices, which seem to arise of their own accord in the continuous repetitions of practice. What is not considered, however, is what I call an imaginary power of transformation, which manifests itself situationally in the contingent but conditioned encounter of human and non-human co-players. Let me exemplify the emergence of this power with another simple example from sport: the invention of the Fosbury flop in high jump. In 1968, at the Olympic Games in Mexico, the US high jumper Dick Fosbury was the first to clear the bar in a major international sporting event using this technique. It is characterized by a fast, arced approach, a turn of the torso during the last steps, and a backward crossing of the bar. Experts initially considered this technique to be a strange individual idiosyncrasy. Well-known high jump coaches were convinced that it would not influence the future of the discipline at all. but they were won. The new technique revolutionized high jumping. By the end of the 1970s, practically all top athletes were jumping in this style. It became the standard, an institution. The conditions of this revolution are manifold. One prerequisite, the first of these, was the material means to perform backwards landings in the form of voluminous foam safety mats, which had been introduced after several serious accidents due to the introduction of new plastic pole vaulting rods. A second prerequisite lay in the athlete's social trajectory. Fosbury was a high jumper and he was a student of practical physics. Despite being 1.93 meters tall, Fosbury had only limited success as a high jumper until he was 21 years old. He was unable to jump higher than the modest height of 1.60 meters, using the established straddle technique. So he began to experiment. His knowledge of physics helped him in this. He realized that with his new technique, he only exposed the body over the bar at hip width and no longer from head to toe as in the straddle. And finally, a third crucial factor, after years of being an outsider in the high jump scene, he came across a trainer who believed in this new technique and systematically developed it with him. In 1968, Fosbury cleared 2.24 meters using the new style and only failed at the then world record height of 2.29 meters. Fosbury's performance explosion immediately motivated other high jumpers to imitate him. 25 years later, in 1993, the Cuban Javier Sotomayor finally cleared 2.45 meters using the flop techniques, thereby adding a full 52 centimeters to his height. His world record still stands today. The new technique's popularity was due not only to the performance explosion it enabled, but also to its image. Fosbury was seen as youthful, dynamic, and modern. In the late 1960s, he surfed on a zeitgeist of change. The media celebrated him as a youthful pioneer in encrusted structures. Translated now into a praxeological theoretical language. This means that Fosbury inscribed himself into the history of high jumping by stubbornly responding to the established routine of high jumping by trying out a new technique, a technique that was contingent on the infrastructure, his personal trajectory, and the zeitgeist. His A, individual history of failure. His B, marginal position in the field of high jump, which, as Bourdieu shows for the literary field, often favors an experimental attitude. His C, knowing how, acquired as a high jumper, for example, in the form of a sense of distance and flight, and his D, explicit theoretical knowledge acquired in physics outside of sport, enabled him to grasp a situational potential that was opening up to him historically in order to create and publicly perform a new technique. This new technique was anchored in the traditional practice of high jumping, but it was also clearly different from it. Furthermore, the example illustrates the constitutive dependency of the emergence of a new practice by the dominant field-specific code, in this case, the outbidding code of competitive sport. The adoption of the new technique by other high jumpers was primarily motivated by the prospect of improved performance and secondary by its relative ease of learning. My last point. Since the days of Fosbury, the socio-technical constellations in which athletic abilities are produced have changed enormously. Not at least new digital technologies and actors, such as commercial data service providers, have emerged, which, as Christina Brümmer has shown using the example of professional football, collect huge amounts of data, have them sifted through for patterns and connections by algorithms that are themselves opaque, and make the results of this analysis available to practitioners in the field. The use of these results changes the way coaches and players view the game deeply. Instead of individual actions, the focus is on identifying typical constellations and coordination problems. The recordings serve not only as a means of solving problems, but also of creating new tactics, strategies, and game systems, Spielsysteme. What is conveyed through the recordings is above all a demand that the players develop a professional view towards the involvement of their own actions in the collectivity of the match moves, and to make their own decisions, which are mostly made quasi-intuitively during the game, the subject of an objectifying evaluation. In this context, in the context of institutionalized analytical practices, such as team and one-to-one talks, the video pictures are attributed a suggestion of objectivity and authority that affects, engages, and responsibilizes the trainer and the player in a new way, together with their visual persuasiveness. As facts that are objectively established in the world and provide evidence, they also have the potential to be used by coaches and players as arguments and justifications for their own interpretation of the game. However, their status remains contested. This is because their valorization as objective knowledge entails a tendency to devalue both the subjective perspective and convictions of the players and the empirical knowledge of the coaches. They are thus the subject of power struggles that not only revolve around the question of what should be considered relevant knowledge for practice, but also around the question of who is recognized as a knowledge carrier. So, at the end, what did I want to achieve with my contribution? Let me summarize this in 5 very simple points. Knowledge, my first point, is not a substance that is contained in the minds and bodies of people or in infrastructures and objects. Ist das zu lesen? Ja. But unfolds in practice in the contingent but conditioned encounter of heterogeneous co-players. Second, such an encounter is not mere contact, but a relationship that only arises if the entities coming into contact are disposed towards one another. A lack of connectivity, on the other hand, results in disablement and exclusion. Third, the abilities that are rendered relevant as knowledge in the encounter are always reflexively tied to the teleoaffective structure and the guiding code of the praxis that is currently performed. In sports, for example, the code of outbidding and laboratory practice to the code of truth production. Fourth, in the encounters between human and non-human participants, existing structures are not only reproduced, rather they also open up situational potentials from which something new can arise. And fifth, with new players such as digital technologies and data, arise new sorts of knowledge and subjectivizing self-knowledge that change a practice effectively when they are recognized as relevant knowledge by key players. So, thank you very much for your attention.